All right, good afternoon. Glad to have you here. I am David Johnson in for Nathan Ingram. We are delighted to have you here today. It is our second solid security setup clinic. So I am really thrilled to have you here. Want to welcome you. We'll be getting started here in just a moment. And I want to invite you to please say hello in the chat. We are going to be having a great event today. We're going to talk about getting solid security all set up for your site and your situation. So I'm looking forward to walking you through solid security. We'll talk about some key security concepts as we go, and we will have a good time. I wanted to also mention one really important thing, which is that while there is a chat window, and I invite you to please say hello in the chat, we also are going to do Q&A today, so I want to invite you to, when you ask a question related to the content, to please use the Q&A window instead, and that will allow your question to appear for others to see, and it'll also allow us to have folks upvote questions. So we'll do our best to take the most upvoted questions as we go. Want to say hello to Tomas and Stacy C. Glad to see you here today. And my name is David Johnson. I'm glad to have the opportunity to be with you today as part of our Solid Security Setup Clinic. Looking forward to a great event today. And I actually haven't communicated with Nathan. I'm not sure where he's at today. So I am at the last minute here, jumping in to host as well as to present today. So a couple of little logistical quirks, and then we'll be on our way as we go. I want to say hello to Charles. Good to see you. Tell us where you're from, too. Stephen, hello. Good afternoon. Paul, and I'm going to guess that's German or Dutch. I'm not actually sure what language that is. So I'm going to say good afternoon or good evening to you. All right. Good. Glad to have you here. We will give folks just another moment or two to join in. Had a number of folks register for today's event, so I know we're going to have a good attendance today. We can have a good number of us here. And as I mentioned, just getting a couple of details and logistics here sorted out on my end while we get things ready to roll for this solid security setup clinic. While we're getting started, oh, wow, we've got a whole bunch more folks to say hello to. So, Stacy, I see your comment about Nathan had a conflict potentially. Okay, that might be what's going on. Elizabeth, hello from Atlanta. And hello to Doug in Toronto and Phoebe in Galveston, Texas. I grew up in Spring, Texas. So that's a beautiful part of the world. And Stephen, you're in Georgia. Really glad to have you all here today. And yes, we are doing today's live stream. Just got a little wires crossed, I guess, about timing and all of that good stuff. So glad that you are here with us. I'm going to go ahead and get started with today's event. And so to do that, what I'm going to do is share my screen, and we will hopefully have the ability for you to see that as well as all the goodies that we're going to walk through today. And I appreciate you bearing with me here just as we get rolling. Now, I am probably not going to be able to monitor the chat during the event because I'll be showing some things off as we go. And so if you wouldn't mind, as I mentioned, please use the Q&A window to help us if you have a question related to today's event. So we're going to get screen sharing going for today, which should be right here. All right. And again, I'm just getting my screen laid out a little bit. So if you would let me know if you're seeing the Solid Security Setup Clinic slide, you could drop that in the chat. That'd be great. And it's been a while since I ran a webinar and presented all at the same time. So I'm just getting the meeting, the window or all the windows arranged. And all right, let's get going here. All right, once again, I'm David Johnson. Glad you're here. We've been saying hello to folks who are already in the event. We're delighted to have you here today. Today, we're going to walk through Solid Security and we're going to show you how to set it up on a site. Now, today we're going to have a little bit of a specialized focus. So if you joined us previously for a Solid Security Setup Clinic, you've seen us walk through the entire setup process. And we started from scratch on a site that did not have Solid Security installed at all. Today we're going to do something slightly different. And that is that we're going to show you, we're going to start with the pro version of Solid Security today. Last time we started from the free version, the basic version of Solid Security. And in that setup process, we showed you from scratch how to set up Solid Security Pro from zero. Today, what we're going to do that's a little bit different is that I do have a site where Solid Security is already configured, and it is the pro version, but I am going to restart the onboarding flow, as we call it, and that way you'll be able to see how the process works. But it'll allow us to save a little bit of time as we skip ahead into having some details arranged as well. So what we're going to do, we're going to set up Solid Security Pro, and as I mentioned, it's already configured on this site, but I'll take you back through as if we were starting from zero, and we'll show you along the way. We're going to discuss some key security concepts. And today, as I mentioned, we're having a little bit of a special focus today, and that is we're going to talk about some of the considerations that are unique to e-commerce sites. Now, I have a site. This is one of the reasons we're using a site where Security Pro is already configured. I have a site with WooCommerce running on it, and WooCommerce, of course, is by far the most popular e-commerce solution in the WordPress universe. But the considerations that we'll talk about today will also cover things that will apply to sites that are not necessarily running WooCommerce, but are in some way accepting funds. If you have transactions on your site, maybe you accept donations, maybe you're using GiveWP as an example, or maybe you use the events calendar or LearnDash or one of the other many other solutions that allow you to accept payments for various purposes on your WordPress site. We're going to talk about some of the unique considerations where Solid Security is concerned, where just security in general, securing your WordPress site are concerned. So we'll be walking through those. We're also going to talk about the differences between Solid Security Basic and Pro, and then of course we are going to do Q&A at the end. So I'm going to talk quickly, and so I appreciate you bearing with me as I do that. We'll talk quickly today. We're going to cover a lot of ground, but I do want to make sure that we hit the most important key concepts along the way, and I will do my best to monitor the Q&A as we go. But as I mentioned before, at the very end, we will definitely have a time that's devoted to Q&A, and at that point in time, I'll make sure that I'm keeping an eye on all the questions that have come in. So we'll do our best to answer those when we get there. So what I'm going to walk you through today is, as before, like I said, if you joined us before, you've heard me say this. We have what we call the Happy Path. The Happy Path is a term that our head of support here at Solid WP uses. His name is Ben Meredith. Many of you know him. He's been around in the WordPress community for many years. So I just want to say happy birthday to you, Ben. Congrats on the launch of your new book. If you haven't checked out Ben Meredith lately, he's got a fantastic new book that he is launching. But he calls this idea the Happy Path. And the Happy Path is when we invite you to set up a product of ours, we actually want to show you what the most recommended version of the setup process actually looks like. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to walk you through what we call the Happy Path of Solid Security Pro. Now on my screen here, just confirming, y'all are able to see my screen. Are you seeing a WordPress dashboard? Please tell me that is the case. All right, great. Okay, cool. As you can see, I have some updates that need to be applied to this site. Maybe this will look familiar. If you are in that situation, you've seen this before. It looks like there's a WooCommerce database update that needs to be applied. Since we're going to tinker with WooCommerce today, I want to make sure that I go ahead and do that. This is not a store that is accepting money. And so if you can see the domain name, it is absolutely not a live transaction site, but it has enough configured of WooCommerce for us to be able to show you what I want to make sure we cover today. And one thing that I want to do slightly differently today that is unique as compared to last time is that I want to show you a view from Solid Central. And there's a reason that I want you to be able to see the view from Solid Central. And so if you're not yet using Solid Central, I have a couple of neat ideas that I want to convey to you. So over here is Solid Central. I'm signed in to a demo account of ours. We have a handful of different websites connected to it. One of the sites that's connected is this one, thebeard.ithem.es. And this was a playground site that my team set up for me when I joined the Solid WP team a little over a year ago. They thought it would be funny to set me up with a vanity URL based on the old iThemes brand, and they called it The Beard. So The Beard is connected to Solid Central. If you haven't seen Solid Central before, this is a management console. It allows you to keep track of what's going on your sites. Now you'll see The Beard is here. It has a little badge here. This badge tells us that it has Solid Security Pro installed. The Beard is also being backed up, so you'll see a backup ran actually earlier today for Solid Backups Next Gen for the site, and it's got that backup in the timeline. And now one of the things that I really want to point out over here is something we call the vulnerabilities view, and this is in Solid Central. For every site that you have connected to Solid Central, you have the ability, if Solid Security is also installed, and by the way, it doesn't matter whether you've used Solid Security Basic or Solid Security Pro on a given site, as long as one of those is installed on the site, you'll be able to see vulnerabilities here in Solid Central. And so this is a quick view of vulnerable software. If you've ever used Solid Security Pro in the past or Solid Security Basic, you know that one of the things we do is run a security scan, which is if you turn it on and enable it, it'll run that scan twice a day, and it scans the software on your site, meaning WordPress, the WordPress core. It also scans plugins and it scans themes, and checks to see if there are any vulnerabilities that exist in those plugins, themes, or WordPress core. And that's great. If you log into a site running Solid Security, you can take a look at the vulnerabilities screen and you can see the vulnerabilities that might exist on your site. I'm going to jump over to that view right now in WordPress so I can show you what it looks like from a single site. I jump over here. These are all the vulnerable software items that have been identified as part of a regularly scheduled security scan on this site. Now you might say, well, why are you leaving these out there? Well, one of the great features of Solid Security Pro is something that we call virtual patching. We're going to cover that in just a little bit. But all of the vulnerabilities that you see here will also be identified here in Central. And the beauty of being able to do this from Solid Central is that you don't have to log in to every WordPress site. So maybe you have 10 sites, 5 sites, 100 sites, 1,000 sites. If you wanted to be able to see what vulnerable software might exist on your sites, then you have the ability to see them all from one nice dashboard here, and you can take action on them right from this location. Now, you might say, wait, David, there's a 9.8 severity vulnerability sitting there. And why does that exist? Well, you'll also see that it's been mitigated. So this is actually not a problem. Now, where we have something like this that's not resolved, I'm going to show you the process of updating a vulnerability as well. Now, I wanted to cover that real quickly because with Solid Security's new setup process, and we adjusted the setup process not long ago, we have made a change so that when you first install Solid Security, and again, this will apply to Solid Security Basic or Solid Security Pro, whichever one you install. When you first install Solid Security, the very first thing we're going to do is ask you which kind of site you're running, and then the next step is to run a vulnerability scan. I say that because that's not going to show up today. The reason it's not going to show up today is because I do have Solid Security already configured. So I wanted to talk quickly about the vulnerability scan and what it does and why we have it right up front. Now, it's the second question we ask you. The very first one is this: what kind of website are you running? I'll come back to this concept in just a second. But when we run the vulnerability scan on your site, again, it is very important for us to distinguish. We're not running a malware scan. We're running a scan for vulnerabilities that are known to exist in either WordPress core, plugins, or themes that are active or installed on your site. So we're not checking for malware. Now you might ask, why is it that you wouldn't check for malware? And the reason that we don't check for malware on your site is because fundamentally, a malware scan that runs from inside of a plugin is flawed. And you will see that some other security solutions for WordPress will run a malware scan. And it's not the case that if they run a malware scan and find something that they're in error. That's not what we're worried about. What we're worried about is that any malware creator worth their salt today is going to, the very first thing they do in their when their malware gets active on your site is bypass the security software that checks for malware. And we see this time and time again in malware that gets published for the WordPress or to published designed to exploit WordPress sites. We see that they shut down the major malware scanners that are out there that are plugin based. So should you run a malware scan? I absolutely am a firm believer in running malware scans. I just don't think you should do it from inside of a plugin. And for that reason, we are currently not running a malware scan from Solid Security. Instead, we scan for vulnerable software instead. And you might say, well, then how do you address the malware question? Malware is something that we will talk about in a little bit more detail a little bit later. But I just want to make sure that we're clear that when we first run a scan in Solid Security, we aren't bothering to check for malware. All we're doing instead is checking for vulnerable software, because that's something you can definitely detect and control as the administrator of your WordPress site. So very much appreciate the opportunity to explain that difference. And all right, very good. I think I may have some help here, which is great. So I think I noticed a chat that it looks like maybe Nathan has joined us. So Nathan, glad you're here. And if that's you, please say hello.
Yes, yes. Sorry about that. I am here.
No worries. No worries. Hey, glad you made it. I told everybody that that I was scrambling here to actually host and and present all at the same time. So I'm delighted you're here, and maybe you can help keep an eye on the chat for us, and also to help when it comes time to Q&A.
Yes, 100%. And folks, I'll have the links in the chat here in just a minute if you want to download the slide deck that David is showing.
All right, awesome. Yeah, I do have those. So glad you're here, Nathan. Glad you made it. All right, cool. So let's jump back to what happens when you first install Solid Security and begin the setup process. Now, the flow that I'm going to show you is the Pro version. It differs very slightly in a couple of ways from the basic setup, but both basic and Pro are going to ask you right away when you first begin the process what kind of site you're running. Now, here's where I want to spend a little more time than I did last time, and that is to talk about the difference between selecting e-commerce, let's say, or nonprofit from maybe one of the other options. Maybe a portfolio, maybe a typical business website might be a brochure website, or a network might be a site that has, for example, different types of users, maybe forums where people communicate. The biggest reason we ask you this question right up front is because we want to understand a little bit about what kinds of users you need to protect on your site from a security point of view, and especially from a login security point of view. If we know that you're running an e-commerce site, for example, then we know that one of the things that may happen on your site is that you may allow customers to create user accounts. Now, you might be one of those folks that says, no, I don't want anybody to have a user account. We're going to only allow guest checkout on our site, never allow people to set up their own username and password. And if that's the case, then we're not worried about those users and their security. But in many cases, we do want users to be able to establish a username and password, be able to come back and log in and see their order history, maybe track order status, those kinds of things. Similarly, if you're a nonprofit and you're accepting donations on your site, maybe you're using GiveWP. They're one of our sister brands, so I'll use them as a great example today. If you're using GiveWP, then you might also allow donors to set up usernames and passwords and maybe come in and look at their donation history, maybe update their recurring donations, change the payment method, handle those things themselves rather than relying on you and your team to do that. And so we ask this question right up front because we want to know what kind of users we might need to protect. And if you're not sure what the best answer is for you, maybe you have both GiveWP and WooCommerce installed on your site. In that case, you can pick one. It's not going to hurt for you to make the choice that is perhaps closest or your best guess. If you don't have those kinds of users to protect and you're really just running a business site, then you might choose something like Brochure instead. But since today we're talking about e-commerce considerations, I'm going to go ahead and choose e-commerce. And at this point in time, I am asked this question about whether it's my site or a client site. Now, I want to just note that if you're setting up basic, you will have been asked another question. The other question that you're asked if you're running basic has to do with allowing our system to detect the correct way for your site to determine the IP address of its visitors. And we don't ask this question in Pro because we're able in Solid Security Pro, we're able to say, look, this is our preferred method for you. And so I want you to always use this preferred method. And we don't need to ask you the question. And we're able to absolutely bypass the question around what method should be used. Now, you might say, well, why is there a difference between basic and pro? And here's what it comes down to. With Solid Security Basic, we distribute that plugin for free on the WordPress.org plugin repository, the normal WordPress directory. That means that you can do things like, for example, come over here to plugins and maybe click add a plugin and search for security. And if you do that, you're going to find Solid Security in the list and you're going to install it. Now, when you install Solid Security from .org, whether you're getting it from inside of WordPress right here or whether you go to WordPress.org and download it and then maybe upload a zip to your site, whichever method that you use, what you're going to find is that we have the need to comply with policies related to .org. And WordPress.org has a very important policy that we adhere to, which has to do with asking you the question. We have to get your permission and initiate user action before your site contacts our servers. We talked about this in a little bit of detail last time. I'm not going to spend much more time on it right now, but just suffice it to say that with Basic, we have to get your permission and have your site contact us. With Pro, we can just set it as the default. We're no longer required because Pro is only available from us. It's not an add-on to the Basic plugin. Instead, you download Solid Security Pro from Solid WP when you purchase it and install it on your sites, or you can install it from Solid Central. But either way, when you do that, we're no longer held as strictly to the requirements of .org, and that means that we can initiate contact with our servers without checking with you. Now, you might say, wait a minute, I don't want my site contacting you. Not to worry. There's nothing personally identifiable being shared anyway. With that service where we determine which method to use to determine user IPs, all we're doing is taking a quick look at the configuration of your server and making a recommendation there and configuring it the best way. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in just a few moments. So there's a question in between there if you are running Solid Security Basic. But in this case, again, I hit the e-commerce site type, and I was actually able to trick this into starting over. So this is going to go ahead and run the site scan. I'm glad I'm able to show this to you. Now, it doesn't take long because it just ran a scan before this. So it is showing me a couple of vulnerabilities, and now I want to be able to continue the setup process. Now, you might say, wait a second, don't we want to address these vulnerabilities? Yeah, maybe these are high severity vulnerabilities in these cases. So maybe you do, but don't worry. We're going to remind you at the end of the setup process about them. So if you're not taking action on them right away, that's okay, because we want to get you through the setup process here real quickly. It only takes a few minutes. I'm going to take a little extra time to set this up relative to what it would take you normally, but that's because I'm going to take a minute to explain a few things. And so again, so grateful to have Nathan here. He's made the slide deck available for those of you that want to download it. So the next thing that we do in the setup process here is we ask you about brute force. Now, we're getting into the zone of trying to determine how best to protect your site from the different types of attacks that you might face. So you might say, well, what is a brute force attack? If you're not familiar, a brute force attack is an attempt on the part of a malicious actor to repeatedly log into your site by guessing username and password combinations. This might also be known as a credential stuffing attack. It could be a dictionary-based attack if you're familiar with the databases that exist online of reused email addresses and passwords. So someone could make an effort to try to break into your site. One of the first things Solid Security does is turn on brute force protection, and it is a firewall-related feature. But what it does is it prevents the users who might be trying to break in from being able to succeed. And what happens is it after they hit a certain number of attempts, by default it's 5, then based on their IP address, we lock them out. Now, remember a minute ago we were talking about detecting the IP address of your visitors? This is why it's important for us to be able to detect their IP address correctly, because if someone is trying to break into your site, we want to block them and not say everybody that's connected to your site through a proxy like Cloudflare. And so if you're using Cloudflare in front of your site, for example, with their proxy service to, for various reasons that you might do that, then Solid Security needs to be able to detect the IP address of the end user, not the IP address of, let's say, a Cloudflare server. If we were to then block a Cloudflare IP, then anyone connecting through that IP, even to the front end of your website, would get blocked, and that would be bad. We only want to keep the bad folks out and the malicious actors. So we ask about setting up local brute force. Network brute force is a variation. So local brute force means locally to your website, we're going to block attackers as we detect them. Network brute force means we share some data. Your site will share some data about attackers back with our network. And all of the sites that are opted in, this is an opt-in situation, all sites that are opted into network brute force share intelligence about known malicious actors and their IP addresses. And so your site is able to be protected from known attacker IPs, even if those attackers haven't yet attacked your site. So we do recommend that you turn this on. I'm going to go ahead and enable it now. And it is something that requires user action, as you see. So we're not turning that on without your permission, but we do invite you to do that. Now, by the way, all of this is covered by the Solid WP privacy policy. And so we are very explicit about what we do with data. We are not collecting data from you in order to sell it or in order to monetize it in any way. But because other people might do that, we make very clear statements about what's happening when you connect your site to our network. And so you can learn more about that, and I'll certainly take any questions that may come up about that. Next step is in the setup process has to do with password strength. So we say right here, hackers love guessable passwords. There's a statistic out there that suggests that about 80% of all hacks can be attributed to password compromises. Now, this has to do with a larger, universe than just WordPress. But hacks are attributed to password compromises because people do things with passwords like, I don't know if you've seen the data. I don't have it in front of me right now, but I think that to this day, when these password data breaches are published, researchers go through them, and I think to this day, Monkey 123 is in the top 3, maybe the top password that's used. And it's just an entertaining fact that sometimes if someone knows your email address, they can start guessing passwords. Now, we've already been able to protect you from the folks that are going to make repeated guesses. That's what brute force does. But in this scenario, what we're able to do is to say, not only are we going to require that you, as a user, an administrator of your website, use a strong password, but we're also going to recommend that you require strong passwords for other users as well. And this is where we get into the big question that came up here earlier as I was clicking through my slide deck. Require for whom? And this is a really key concept where Solid Security is concerned, especially when we get to login security. You want your login form to be protected, but when it comes to say requiring strong passwords, you're running an e-commerce business. In our example today, you have a WooCommerce site, you have a donation-based site. Is it necessarily true that you want to require that everyone have a strong password, or are you only trying to protect those folks who have privileges on your site in some way? And this is where you get to make a customer service and support choice based on your business and your organization and your needs, right? So when we say we're going to require strong passwords and maybe refuse compromised passwords, we were talking about data breaches a moment ago. That's when databases get unloaded on the web. We have an API that we can run to check email addresses associated with your users against those known databases. And if a password hash for a password they're attempting to use on your site matches one from a leaked or compromised data breach, then we can refuse those as well. So when you turn these on, the question is for whom? And this is where I need to take just a minute and talk about this concept. It's going to come up again. So I'm going to take a moment now. You might think, well, hey, we're moving a little slowly. And that's because this concept applies in a few different places throughout Solid Security. So in the case of WordPress, when you install it, you get these. You're going to recognize these roles. You get an administrator role, editor, all the way down to subscriber. These are the default 6 roles that come with any WordPress site. As soon as you install WooCommerce, you're going to find that your site also has some additional roles. And I didn't bother to take a moment and pull those up, but I can jump over here for a second into, I'm opening this in a new tab so we don't lose our place in the flow. If I were to go create a new user on this site, you'll see that I have 2 additional roles here, the shop manager and the customer. And the shop manager has privileges related to WooCommerce. They may not be an administrator of your site, but they can do things like edit products. They can disable products, change pricing, those kinds of things. Whereas a customer role is clearly what you would think, right? That person can only deal with their own purchases on your site. Maybe look at their account history. So in addition to the installed roles that come by default with WordPress, you also have a couple of additional roles that get added when you install WooCommerce, and that is true of GiveWP. If you set it up as a donation management platform, it installs some user roles. Then there are roles in things like LearnDash or TEC or in any number of other plugins or tools that you may install on your WordPress site that allow money to change hands. Roles are often involved. So when we ask the question for whom, we actually recommend, and it's right here. I think that I zoomed in last time, and I haven't done that this time. So let me zoom in a little bit. And this might be a little bit easier to see. I'm gonna have to scroll up and down. Our stuff fits nicely in the window if I'm not zoomed in, but when I am zoomed in, you can see it a little better. So you'll see that we're requiring strong passwords if we enable this, and refusing compromised passwords if we enable this. But this is the question for whom. And so we say by default, and we recommend that you turn these on. If you enable either of these or both, they'll be enabled for editor capabilities in Grader, unless you click this and change. Now you can change this to administrator capabilities. So meaning if someone has a user account that maybe is a shop manager on your site, if you choose editor capabilities in Grader, then that user will also have to have a strong password, as well as anyone with similar privileges that may or may not have WooCommerce privileges, but maybe they're an editor on the site in terms of blog posts or page content or whatever else. And Grader, meaning all the way up to administrator. Or if you say, well, no, I really don't care about those folks. I'm not sure why you would say this, but let's say you did. I don't really want to make everyone have a strong password. Only those with administrator capabilities, you have that choice. If you set it to everyone, then that'll include everyone, and that means shoppers or donors or other folks as well. As long as they sign into WordPress, they'll be affected by this change. So for now, I'm going to set it to editor capabilities in Grader, which is the default, and that's what we recommend. These features are designed to keep your site safe from compromise in the case of someone who might be able to get up to some real shenanigans. Maybe a shopper can affect someone's, order tracking by viewing it or whatever. Maybe they can maybe make another purchase or make another donation. That's a problem, but it's a real problem if someone is able to guess a password and then start editing your site and installing malware or redirecting users to other places. So it's really a question of how far up the chain do you want to go? And I liken it to an elevator. This is a great analogy. Do you want this key card swipe in the elevator to apply to all of the floors, or only the top floors where the big stuff happens, right? So that's the thinking about that analogy. And you do get to make that choice here. Now I'll continue, and again, we're going to pick up the speed here. With the next step, we're going to talk about requiring two-factor. In the case of Solid Security Pro, we have the ability to require two-factor. Now, this is a difference. If I were setting up Solid Security Basic, this screen doesn't say require two-factor. It says enable two-factor. Of course, we can see the value in requiring it when we have it, but let's first just quickly cover what is the concept of two-factor. Two-factor authentication is the idea that in addition to the username and password or the email address and password required to log in, for someone to log into your site, when you have required two-factor, they will also need to be able to supply a second authentication factor. This is known as 2FA, two-factor authentication. And of course, you've all seen this before. You've signed into your bank's website and they text you a code over SMS, the most vulnerable. I mean, if there were ever anything more vulnerable than email, uh, why wouldn't we send our two-factor over the most insecure thing possible? Email is actually more secure now in today's world than text messaging is. And so you might say, well, then what two-factor options do you make available with Solid Security? And we have several options for you. And the one that's the most powerful and the one that I recommend is the use of an authenticator app. And this might be Google Authenticator. It might be something like Authy, which is a third-party app that's available on all the platforms, iOS and Android, for example, that is now owned by Twilio. There are other open source apps that you can use that will similarly handle these codes, but you're familiar with the flow. If you enable two-factor on your site with Solid Security Basic, or if you require it with Solid Security Pro, your users will be able to, or in the case of Pro, be required to enroll in two-factor, and then they will be able to choose from the options that you turn on. We'll talk about those options in a little more detail in a minute. I'll show you how to enable them, but those options are an email link, meaning that the second factor might just be that they click on a link in an email to prove that they have access to the email address, and they're not just someone with that knows the email address and the password. Or it might be an authenticator app like we just talked about, or meaning they'll have a 6-digit code to enter, which the app will display. Or it could be a backup code. And a backup code is one of those things that we recommend if you enable 2FA, so that if you ever lose access to your app, your authenticator app, then you have some codes that you can use. So we'll talk about those. But again, with this in Pro, we are requiring two-factor rather than enabling it. And again, who do we require it for? Editor and up, administrator only, or everyone? And again, this is based on roles, not or based on privileges, not strictly roles. And so anyone who's got capabilities of an editor and up will be affected by this change if you proceed. All right. Now, this is the question that came up earlier, and this is what prompted me to think, I think I can do a better job than that. So I was able to back up a little bit. So now it's going to ask, which kind of site is this? Is it your own site, or is this a site that you manage on behalf of clients? The reason we asked this question, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. We did in our previous setup talk, is that if it's your own website, then the next steps are pretty straightforward. If it's a client site, then you get to decide as the person setting up Solid Security if you want your client to be able to manage and affect security policies and settings on the site. Can they administer Solid Security Pro or not? And so if you choose client site, then you have some options related to that. For now, I'm going to choose my own site. That should simplify this a little bit. Next step here, and we're almost finished with this process. So next step here is to talk about how we detect IP addresses. This is the security check scan, and this is also this is the feature we were talking about a few minutes ago. If you were setting up Basic, you'd have been asked a question about this earlier, and you would have been able to choose to turn it on or not. It does interact with our servers briefly to figure out what the best configuration for your site is, and that's why we have to ask you with Basic. In Pro, we turn it on by default, and it is the recommended choice, and you can always check right here to see if it has detected your IP address correctly. And so what you might do is hop over to myipaddress.com, and you can see that this site has determined that that's my IP, and it happens to match here. Now, some of the other options get very technical. I'm not going to spend time on those, but I do recommend that you just use this. It'll save you some trouble. And if you click authorize my IP address, what that means is that your IP address will be prevented from ever being locked out by Solid Security if you add it right now as an authorized IP. So I recommend that you do this if your IP address doesn't change frequently. But if you're traveling around, you're using a VPN from time to time, or maybe you're working from coffee shops or whatever, your IP address is not going to be as stable. So although it might not be a bad idea to do this from your home IP, it may not make as much sense for you to do this from, let's say, an IP address that you're only visiting, because then anyone who might be originating from that IP address would also be prevented from getting locked out if they were originating from that IP. So do this when it's an IP address that doesn't change frequently, like your office or your home IP. All right, and I'll click next. And the next thing we do here in the setup process is we show you a handful of the most sort of critical settings. And so, you know, this is a rehash for now because we've already enabled two-factor, we've enabled passwordless login, or we do this by default. Whoops, I didn't mean to click the help button. Passwordless login is something I saw a question come by a minute ago. Someone asked about passwordless login in the form of passkeys. Passkeys is one option. It's available to you in Solid Security Pro, not available in Basic. You can allow users to use passwordless login with passkeys in Solid Security Pro. You can also use a passwordless variety that is just a login loop, a so-called magic link. It's an email loop. And so that's a way to avoid, if someone wants to log in and maybe doesn't want to enter their password, doesn't remember, doesn't have it handy, you can enable that and allow them to set those up or to log in with a magic email link. And that's familiar to you, right? It's similar to what happens when you need to reset your password on a WordPress site. Trusted devices. This gets into a fairly technical set of concepts, but I will just bruise it real quickly by saying this. If you have required 2FA, two-factor authentication, and you want to be a little nicer to your users that log in the most frequently, you have the ability to enable trusted devices, and you have some choices there. What that means is that if I am logging into WordPress and I have two-factor authentication enabled, if this trusted devices feature is enabled, I'll have a little checkbox, and it's similar to something you may have seen on other sites where I can check the box and say, please remember this device, trust this device, so that I don't have to enter my 2FA code every single time. And you do have a lot of control over which users are affected by all of these settings. And right now, we're just looking at whether they're enabled or not. The firewall, similarly, we have the firewall rules engine that needs to be enabled. We have local and network brute force enabled already. Magic links is a feature of that allows you to log in when your username or your IP address is locked out. That's why it's under firewall. If you ever do get locked out of your site because your IP address gets conflated with, you know, someone attacking the site, or maybe you really did forget your password and you tried a few times and you get locked out, you really don't want to be stuck. And so with Magic Links, you have the ability to log in when your username or IP is locked out. By the way, that's another great reason to use Solid Central. If you are using Solid Central from or if you're using Solid Security along with Solid Central, you can also release any lockouts and right from here, or you can authorize IP addresses temporarily right from here as well. So if you're locked out from your site, Solid Central may be able to help you so you don't have to contact support to get back in. Magic links are another way to help you from needing to do that. CAPTCHA is another feature that allows you to protect your site from bots. These are the things that you might expect. Enabling it isn't enough. You need to then configure one of the third-party CAPTCHA providers and do some setup there. And I don't have the time today to do that, but we can talk about that if you have questions about it. Feel free to ask them. And Site Check is the regularly scheduled site scan. And so we enable this and recommend it. By default, it's enabled in Solid Security Pro. In Solid Security Basic, you have to enable it if you wish to use it. It does briefly contact our servers again during the site scan process. But what this does is it's the security scan that we talked about a few minutes ago. We're checking to see if you have vulnerable software on your site. We do that twice a day. And then now we get to the sort of the meat of how we configure settings for the various scenarios that you might be familiar with in, that's not perhaps the best way to phrase it. It's the way that you have granular control over which types of users are affected by which settings. Now, earlier we talked about these roles and maybe the additional roles that come along with WordPress. Roles are not how we do things with Solid Security. Instead, we have to think about them in terms of capabilities, and that means we need to be able to accomplish them by grouping users together. I'm going to click Default User Groups, and you'll see what comes up. There is a user group configured that matches the name of each of the roles on your site. And this is where some people get a little bit confused. Sometimes it's confusing if you see, oh, administrators or authors or whatever. This looks like the same list. And that's because by default, if you set up default user groups, it's going to place everybody that's an editor in the editor user group and everybody that's an administrator in the administrator user group and so forth. But if you've done something like configured earlier in the setup process, if you've done something like said, hey, I want all people who are editors, have editor privileges or above, to be affected by maybe require two-factor or a strong password or whatever the setting might have been, then this is actually how that gets implemented. And so you get to look here to see what specific features are enabled or required for each of the groups. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but this is a hugely powerful tool. You can also set up people that are or are not allowed to manage solid security. We talked about clients earlier. That might be a way to do that. This would be where we determine what happens with your customers. So the folks that purchase through your website, not your clients if you're managing a site and the site belongs to your client, but instead someone who might be an end user that checks out with a purchase from this website. That's what customers refers to in this case. And so you can see we don't have strong passwords required for those folks. So in other words, what you should see here is that the settings that we've enabled or required earlier based on the choices we've made are configured here. You can add more user groups if you wish, and for each group, you have the ability to determine exactly who's in it, all the way down to not just capabilities, but also specific user accounts. And so if you need to create a special case for a certain user, you have the ability to do that. There's a tremendous amount of flexibility here, but because user groups can be a little similar looking to the user roles in WordPress, we need to spend a minute here and make sure you get that these are distinct and that there's a lot of power and flexibility here with user groups. And just imagine that you have a lot of granular control, and that's going to be true. So I don't want to spend a lot more time on this today. The last step here is just to determine who gets notified when something happens related to solid security. And you can see that you can set the from email address that any email notifications from solid security will be sent from, and you can determine who gets those emails. All administrators and all shop manager users are checked by default. That's because WordPress and WooCommerce is installed. So we check those by default, but you can also select specific users or uncheck and configure it as you wish. And when I hit complete setup, this is where we actually apply all of those changes to the site. We do some work in the background. As I mentioned earlier, we ran that security vulnerable software scan. And so this is your reminder right here. There were vulnerable software issues found. And so you can click manage vulnerabilities from here and go address them. I'm not going to do that right now for the sake of time. But then we also just do a little quick recap to show you some of what got configured. And then we also we mentioned what all is in Solid Security Pro that may not be in Basic. So passwordless login and passkeys, as we mentioned earlier, that CAPTCHA tool, which by the way can protect your login form, but it can also protect your comment form. If you're getting spam comments, just turn on a CAPTCHA, set up, Cloudflare Turnstile is my recommendation actually personally, and so forth. Trusted Devices is available with Pro. WPCLI, we have a number of command line interface tools available for Solid Security for managing it. If you connect with your site via SSH and you're familiar with using WPCLI, then you have a lot of power to administer Solid Security via the command line, and that's available in Solid Security Pro. And there's import and export of settings. I didn't show it earlier, but there was an opportunity to actually import. So like once you get a site set up and you know that this is the way I like to set up sites, you can export that Solid Security configuration and just bring it with you. Next time you set up a Solid Security site, just import the file and boom. The settings are there, and you'll just have to fine tune a few details related to the specific site and so forth. And of course, we talked about two-factor. Version management also gives you some control over what happens with updates to plugins and themes and so forth in WordPress core. So there's some really powerful tools available there. That is the end of the actual setup process. And again, it only takes a few minutes once you've learned your way through it. I took a little extra time today to explain. And then I'm going to just jump over real quickly and show you the Solid Security dashboard. And this is where there is a summary of what's going on your site right now. And so you'll see we have some alerts up here. These relate to some issues that were found in the scan. There are tremendous logs in here. It's yelling at me in red about my vulnerable software, and that's good. I want it to do that. And so there's quite a bit that's available to you in here. Now I will jump in real quickly back into settings so that I can show you where to find. So once you've been through the setup process, you might say, well, where do I go find those user groups or those features that we configured earlier? And those are here. So you can see features are here, and there's a lot more detail available here. So in two-factor, for example, you can now say which options are available to your users. You can say, I want to enable all methods for my users of second factor or just email, or I want to select them manually. And so if you select them manually, you'll see we have the mobile app, email, and backup authentication codes. So you can determine what works best for you. You have the ability to customize the text that users are presented with when they're first initiated into two-factor, which will be their next login if you're requiring it in Solid Security Pro. Any user for whom it's required will be required to enroll on the next login. And then we've got lots of other tools here. Passkeys is a big topic. I did see a question related to passkeys. I'm not going to be able to demo it today because I haven't got the correct device set up to show passkeys. But passkeys, if you're familiar with this concept, it's just passkeys are truly amazing. Passkeys allow you to give users a way to bypass the need to enter a password and even a second factor if they log in with a device that supports biometrics or, for example, a security key like a YubiKey. And I have a YubiKey right here that I'm showing on camera. I don't know how well you can see that. But if you have one of these, a YubiKey will be supported by the passkeys implementation that we have. And it's a very, very powerful tool, and it does increase security quite a bit, and it also simplifies logins if you enable it and make that available for your users. So I do highly recommend passkeys as a really powerful option. We didn't talk about it in our last security setup clinic because we spent our time showing basic, but that is one of the really tremendous great differences between Solid Security Basic and Pro is that passkeys are available to you here. And we were the first security solution for WordPress to implement passkeys. And I will tell you, it is an incredibly robust implementation. It works really well. And we've also created an ability, we're moving in the direction of it's not there yet, but we're moving in the direction of giving you a way to disable passwords entirely if you have everyone enrolled in passkeys on your site. It's a really cool option. And boy, does it increase security for your site. It's a tremendous opportunity to do that. So I could cover all sorts of other details in the settings. There are a tremendous number of different, ways to configure Solid Security Pro. You have lots of flexibility there. But for the sake of time and for the sake of jumping back in, I want to kind of wind up. I've actually covered the differences between Basic and Pro in a fair amount of detail already, so I don't want to spend additional time here. If you do have a question related to those differences, we can certainly talk about those in the Q&A section. And next, we're going to get to questions, but I do want to mention one thing here. First of all, I want to thank you for coming today. We have about 7 minutes left in our original schedule. I've talked very quickly. And so I'm sure that there are some questions lined up, and we'll be tackling those in just a moment. But I do want to say, if you're seeing the power of Solid Security Pro, as a thank you for joining us today, I want to invite you to take advantage of a 25% discount as a result of coming to today's webinar. This was only good on new Solid Security Pro purchases. So if you're already a Solid Security Pro user and you need some additional licenses, then by all means, buy some new licenses. You can do that with this deal. If you're not yet a Pro user, maybe you're a Solid Security Basic user and you're seeing the power of Pro, being able to do things like implement two-factor and require it, not just implement it, but require it for certain types of users, or do things like allow passwordless login and passkeys and some of the other tools. The other thing that I haven't spent time on today in much detail is this concept of virtual patching. I kind of just mentioned it briefly earlier. We have an incredible solution for vulnerable software that's powered by the good folks at PatchStack. And when you purchase Solid Security Pro, each license of Solid Security Pro comes with a license to enable virtual patching on your site. And I can talk about it in more detail in the Q&A section, but I will just mention that what it does is it prevents your site from being being exploited from known vulnerabilities and even some vulnerabilities that may not yet be disclosed by using surgical firewall rules to prevent the exploitation of those vulnerabilities even while you sleep. So if a vulnerability gets disclosed on the other side of the world and you're asleep, and those are now being exploited in minutes, as we know, if you have PatchStack virtual patching enabled, and the folks at PatchStack have determined that a virtual patch makes sense. In other words, any vulnerability of a certain severity or above, they're going to create a virtual patch for. They will protect your site automatically. It's a very high performance solution. It doesn't protect you from millions and millions of vulnerabilities. It only protects you from the vulnerabilities that are actually there on your site. So it doesn't use a lot of resources. It's a surgical solution, very powerful, and that's available with Solid Security Pro. It's one of the many reasons to upgrade. You do need this Security Clinic 25 coupon code if you want to take advantage of the offer. And you can go to solidwp.com/security. But make sure you grab that Security Clinic 25 code and you'll be able to take 25% off your purchase. We're giving you through the 14th of March, Pi Day, just in case you're watching this as a replay and not live. But speaking of live, office hours tomorrow, correct, Nathan?
Correct.
All right. I want to just mention this is one of the greatest things ever. It's one of the things I love most about Solid Academy. If you haven't been to office hours, then I truly invite you to join Nathan for that. It is part of the paid membership to Solid Academy, which is available if you are a Solid Suite purchaser, not just security, but suite, the Solid Suite. And so those of you who are members, you already know. I just want to remind you, be here tomorrow, 1 o'clock Central Time for office hours with Nathan Ingram. And I'll keep this this code up, but we will jump over and start to do Q&A. I don't know why we have fancy transitions in this deck, but we do.
It's a great transition.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, great stuff today, David. Again, if you haven't asked your question and you have one, please open up the Zoom Q&A and drop that question in there. If you would like also to review the questions that have been asked already, you can upvote the questions that you would like to see answered, and we will start to take those questions now in the order of upvotes. So first one that came in is from Stacy. Stacy would like to know, in regard to the brute force settings that you talked about, and you mentioned some things having to do with Cloudflare. Is there anything specific we need to do if we're using Cloudflare in regard to these brute force settings?
Yes. So the biggest thing is that if you're using Solid Security Pro, it should work automatically out of the box without you having to touch it. If you're using Basic, or if you've tinkered with your Solid Security Pro settings, then one place that I would invite you to check is over here with respect to, and of course I'm not going to be able to find it right now because it's one of the things that I always configure this during the setup. It's under global settings, isn't it? Yep. Okay. IP detection. Here it is. So once I set it, I almost never go back to it. So under security and settings, it is in the first tab. This is global settings is the first tab that opens up. Oh, by the way, there's also this handy dandy search right up here because we have so many settings screens and feature screens in Solid Security. So you can also search. I don't know why that didn't occur to me. But anyway, it's called IP detection. And this is the thing that is enabled by default in Pro, but we ask you about when you're setting up Basic. If you turn this on, it will say, in Basic, I think it's labeled Security Check Pro. In Solid Security Pro, this is the feature, and it's turned on by default. If you do this, it will handle Cloudflare and many other third-party proxy solutions automatically. It does some magic to detect the correct methodology for understanding your user IPs. Other than that, there's nothing that I'm aware of related to Cloudflare and Solid Security that you need to really think about with respect to making sure they work well together. This is really the place that sometimes people run into trouble. If you have this set to unconfigured, for example, then what happens is that the site just uses whatever IP address header comes through, and it doesn't really pay attention to anything else. Whereas with Security Check Scan, when this scan runs, this figures out what kind of headers are coming through from your visitors, and it will automatically detect any proxy headers and configure that correctly so that Solid Security uses the correct IP address information.
Yeah, very good. And that IP, just for clarity, that's for the server, not for you as a user. right?
Good. I'm glad you asked this question because this
There was a
gets.
question that came up in the chat just now.
Yeah, no, this gets this. Yeah, okay, good. All right. So thank you, whoever asked this question. Thank you. No, this is the IP address of every single visitor, including me as an administrator right now. So this is why it's detecting my IP address and showing it to me. If I had this configured in some way that was incorrect, if I disabled IP detection, well, actually, no, that's a whole other layer. But in any case, if I had this configured incorrectly and this site were behind Cloudflare, this one is not, or some other proxy, then it's possible that my IP address that would show here would be one that is not the IP address I'm coming from. It could be a Cloudflare IP, for example, instead. And so if that's misconfigured, then that's a problem. But it is the IP address not of your server, but the IP address your server uses and Solid Security uses to figure out the IP of your visitor. In other words, how do the folks loading your site in a browser, what IP address are they coming from? Whether they're visiting the outside of your site, whether they're signing in or even administering your site, those are the IP addresses we care about for brute force, for all the firewall rules, and for things like making sure you don't get locked out.
Yeah. So this is why it's important to use the security check scan, which is the recommended method if you're
Yes.
behind Cloudflare, so that just in case the Cloudflare IP doesn't get blacklisted on your site.
Exactly. And there's an article that goes into a lot more detail about what happens. And like I mentioned, Unconfigured has some weird components to it. But in any case, this is where you can learn about all of the things that go on there. And of course, I'm happy to answer more questions. But that's the biggest thing. If you're using Cloudflare, just use this setting. It's recommended.
Good. Let's see. We talked about passkeys a bit. There was a question that popped up about a demo, and I dropped in a couple times actually in the chat a link to a live stream we did sometime back when Timothy Jacobs, the lead developer at SolidWP, did a great walkthrough of all the passwordless login options, including passkeys. And I believe all those things are the same
Yes.
now as they were when Timothy did that walkthrough. So if you want to learn more about passkeys, or if you've had trouble, rewatch that live stream. Just scroll up in the chat, you'll see that, and that should answer all your questions there. As I recall, there was a great Q&A in that live stream also with some good practical
I don't think I've
questions and
seen
answers.
that. I would say there is one new development, and it won't change any of the content of that webinar particularly, but we have added the ability for you as a WordPress administrator, if you allow people to create accounts on your site from the front end, in other words, if you had the allow registration feature turned on, there's now a way with Solid Security Pro to enable the passwordless creation of an account as long as someone uses a passkey so in other words, if they come to your site, register as, let's say, a subscriber, customer, whatever it might be, if you're using the default WordPress login and registration flow, it can interrupt that. If they enroll a passkey, they're never asked for a password. They never need a password. They can always log in with passkeys. Yeah, that's a new feature, but that wouldn't have existed yet when that webinar was created.
No, although the title of Timothy's slides in that live stream is "Let's Kill the Password."
Yes, yeah,
this is a good thing.
We're moving in that direction. We're inching there. We've got a little bit, like, we don't want to give people, as what Timothy uses this term a lot. I think it's a hilarious term. We don't want to give people a foot gun. So we're designing that feature very carefully because once you take passwords away and only have something like passkeys, then there's no getting around it.
Yeah. Here's a good question from Greg. What is your preferred XML RPC and REST API settings?
Oh boy, I'm going to tell you my opinion, and my opinion is going to be highly skewed by the fact that I love automation and I love tools that use XML RPC, so I leave it turned on. The official recommendation these days from us as if you got a panel of people that know about security on SolidWP together, they would say, turn it off. There's no good reason for XML RPC to be enabled, and we do have. That's one of the features we provide in Solid Security is the ability to just turn it off, and you can disable it there. We are fans of the REST API, however, and so Solid Security Pro has app password support. In fact, if you connect a site to Solid Central these days, if you were to add a site to your Solid Central account and connect it that way, it actually authenticates via the application password feature in WordPress. That's been in WordPress core for a little while now. And here's an example. So we have application passwords enabled for the REST API and XML RPC, and you can revoke these here right from the user profile page for your account. And by the way, this is also where you can set up things like your own passwordless login settings as a user. Any passkeys, you can see I have a couple of passkeys already set up on this device, and then any trusted devices data, which I do have trusted devices enabled. You see it thinks. Yeah, geolocation is kind of okay. It's not accurate. I'm not in Port Charlotte, but I'm not far.
So as far as XML RPC goes, it's sort of a
Yep.
double-edged sword. It does provide functionality for some external communication and with other services. However, it might be the single biggest security risk in WordPress.
It is. It's like the first thing that hackers try, like from the
Exactly.
outside, they try to beat the daylights out of your XML RPC endpoint. And
Yeah,
unless you have a good reason to turn it on, you should turn it off.
right.
Yeah.
So Jetpack is probably the biggest culprit today that still uses XML RPC. So if you're using Jetpack, you have to have that enabled. But otherwise, a lot of folks are concerned about showing, allowing REST API calls, and it's really not that big of a security risk.
No.
All the stuff you can access by REST API is basically the same stuff you could access on the front end of the website.
Well, yes. And with authentication to the REST API, we're able to do a lot of much more sophisticated things, right? So app developers and folks like us, like with Solid Central, for example, when we say, hey, we're going to install a plugin or update a plugin on a site or whatever, we're doing all of that over the REST API, but in a very encrypted, highly secure channel based on that app password and the privileges of the user that was that the app password was generated through. So the REST API is going to continue to grow. It is the way of the future, unless we talk about GraphQL, and that's a whole other question. But anyway, REST API, I highly recommend. It has become the standard. So if you have to choose between XML RPC and the REST API, by all means, disable XML RPC and use the REST API instead.
Yep, very good.
Yep.
Here's a question from N Bell. I'm setting up a new site. It's currently in coming soon mode, so the public can't access it. Should I set up solid security now while I'm developing, or is it best to leave it to the last stage before going public?
That might depend on what tool you're using to display coming soon. There may be a scenario in which what I'm about to tell you is bad advice, but generally speaking, I would say go ahead and configure it now. Like, how soon is it a problem if a hacker gets into your site? Is it after you launch, or is it while you're developing it? And so my recommendation is protect the site now while it's under development. That gives you two things. Not only A, does it give you the protection that you need while your site's under development, but B, it also means that when the day comes that your site goes live, you're not introducing yet another variable in the launch process, which is like, hey, we took the site live, but then we turned on all these security settings, and now, oh my gosh, something broke. I don't expect that to happen, but fewer variables at launch is a better scenario in my book.
Yeah, absolutely. And from our perspective, when we're building sites for clients, security is installed and active with our base settings for every site. It's just active in the starter site that we replicate for client projects. And so we develop with it on, there's no problems. And then in launch, there's a few things we'll look at just to make sure that it's exactly what this client needs. But yeah, we develop with it on, have no issues whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are some ways to do the coming soon bit that could interact weirdly. Some of them redirect login pages and do other weird shenanigans. And so, yeah, you might have some compatibility if it's one of the bizarre ways to do it. But if you're doing it in one of the more common ways, you shouldn't have a problem.
Yep. All right, I know we're right at almost 10 minutes after here. There's two questions left that we can answer, I think, very quickly.
I have more time. I just wanted to pop up a thank you, and my Blue Sky ID is there. But yeah, happy to stay on as long as you wish, Nathan. I don't want to hold you up, but I can stay on a little longer.
Great, all good. So Phoebe would like to. Her question was, does the two-factor go to Solid Central, or is it someplace else?
Well, we could get into potentially confusing territory here, but two-factor is when you enable it in Solid Security Pro, it is related to logging into WordPress on that site. Separately speaking, if you're using Solid Central, you can enable two-factor for your Solid Central account. And that is a separate process, and it works in much the same way in that I don't have it enabled on this demo account. But if I were to enable it, it would show me a QR code. I'm going to cancel. I'm going to cancel that. Now that that has been very publicly displayed,
And
I'm not going to enroll that two-factor code right now for Solid Central.
I think her question was, do you see the confirmation for the two-factor prompt in Solid Central?
Only if you're signing into Solid Central. If you're signing into your website, you will see the two-factor prompt right here. So I just logged out of WordPress. And so when I log in, oh, and this is part of the reason I was already signed in when I joined earlier. Hang on, I've got to pull over the login information for the site. But in any case,
That's right. I think we got the question
You'll
answered.
see it. You'll see it here. Yeah.
Yeah. If there's more specificity to that question, just drop it in the chat and we'll clear that up. And finally,
you can bypass 2FA for a given user from Central if you have.
Yes.
If you have, that's nice. If you ever get locked out of your site and your two-factor went kaput, or whatever, you got a way around it there. Yeah.
that's really good information, and that was what Phoebe was after. Great.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, cool.
Final question here from Damien: is there a way to have specific alerts from certain items in Solid Security go to certain people, or is it all alerts to whoever is selected?
Right now, we're gonna send them by default to the people that you've selected. So everything would go to everyone. This is one of those things that I probably should log in and double check.
Because yeah, and I think there's some granularity in the notification settings.
Yeah, certain types of notifications, I think you do have some granularity. I'm glad that you're the host today, Nathan, because you're able to get me out of the weeds here. Here's the 2FA, and once I get this entered, I'll be able to show you the email controls for notifications. There is some granular control in there, and I'm just pulling up. I use Authy myself, so that's the app that I'm pulling up right now, and so I have a 6-digit code and popped it in. Okay, cool. So under settings, sorry, not normal settings, but security settings, there is a notifications area, and this gives you control over each notification type.
Yeah.
And so
yeah, you can set a custom recipient for the Security Digest, say, to go to a different set of people than the standard notifications go to.
Exactly. And some of these you have a lot of control. You can actually customize the email. There's a lot of thought that's been given to you using Solid Security as an agency and white labeling it for your client. You can prevent them from even seeing that it exists. But in some cases, you might want certain types of notifications to go to them, and you have the ability to control a lot in there. And this is one of those things that as soon as I look at the screen, I'm like, oh yeah, of course, we have all this control.
Excellent. Penny, I'd like to answer your question, but I'm not quite sure what you're asking when you're referring to automatic website login. If you can give some more detail in the chat while we answer Charles's question, we'll try to get that answered for you.
I may have a thought about what she means by that. In Solid Central, I have a site admin link here.
Mm-hmm.
If I click it, it will log me in
automatically.
So your question is, can you disable it? And I don't actually remember off the top of my head if there's a way to disable this. I don't think so, but I don't recall for certain.
Okay, that's what she's asking. Yeah,
cool.
that seems to be, that's baked into Central.
Yeah, this is, I don't think we have, if that's something you would like to see though, Penny, we do have a way for you to submit a feature request and allow folks to upvote it. So would love to see you do that.
Yeah, very good. All right, final question, and it takes us back to the 25% discount. That is a great deal for anybody watching today through March the 14th. Charles would like to know, does that apply only to Solid Security, or can they get the suite or other, Central Pro is what he's asking for here?
What a great question. This code is only for Security Pro. However, if you drop an email, actually if you're drop us an email. Send me an email, david@solidwp.com. Send me an email and let me know what you would like to purchase, and I will make sure, as long as you do this and we get it all done before March 14th, we get you the discount that you're looking for off of something else. So I know I've just made this email address very public.
It's been
So
public. It's been
it's been
out
public for
there.
a long time. So yeah, if you are looking to buy more than just solid security, let me know. We'll get you taken care of. But that coupon code right there, is Security Clinic 25, only applies to Solid Security Pro as of right now.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think that wraps us up for today. Sorry, I was tardy today. I'm going to drop
No.
in once again the link bundle that is there in the chat if you want to download David's slides. We'll also have the replay up sometime around between 3 and 4 p.m. Central. That replay will be live where you can go back and rewatch or share at the link that is also there in the chat. David, any final thoughts before we close?
I just want to say, hey, thanks for being here today. Nathan, thank you for joining. I wasn't sure what would happen when I joined as the Academy user, if we could
Sorry
both
about
be
that.
here. No. I'm glad you made it. So thank you for all your help. As always, the amazing host that you always are. And yeah, I really appreciate everybody being here. We are going to do more of these. The plan is to do more of these. So if there are things you would like us to cover in more detail in a future Solid Security Setup Clinic, we want to hear from you. You can just fill out the contact form on solidwp.com if nothing else. Or if you remember my email address that I mentioned 90 seconds ago, you can drop me an email there and we'll be sure to cover something in more detail. But really grateful for your attendance today and excited to have you here. And make sure you join Nathan on office hours tomorrow.
Yep, that is tomorrow. So thanks everybody for hanging out with us. We are back tomorrow, 1 p.m. Central for members with office hours here on Solid Academy, where we go further together.